Hello and welcome. You're watching Infofeed. How many people does it take to send a country to war? In some democracies, it requires a supermajority. In others, a prolonged congressional debate. But in Australia, it takes exactly two people sitting in a closed room, the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister. In March 2026, the Middle East is burning. The United States and Israel are engaging in an escalating conflict with Iran. And halfway across the world, Australia has made a decision. The government of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has ordered the deployment of 85 military personnel, a highly advanced Boeing E-7A Wedgetail surveillance aircraft, and stocks of medium-range air-to-air missiles to the United Arab Emirates. The government calls it a purely defensive measure, a necessary step to protect Australians in a volatile region. But a fierce political rebellion has erupted at home. The Australian Greens have launched a scathing accusation against the federal government. They claim Labor has bypassed the parliament, ignored the public, and quietly dragged the nation into another US-led forever war. They argue that even a defensive deployment frees up American weapons for offensive strikes, effectively making Canberra a complicit partner in the conflict. On March 10, 2026, the Australian government confirmed it was deploying 85 Australian Defence Force personnel alongside an E-7A Wedgetail to the United Arab Emirates. They are also supplying MIM-120C AMRAAM air-to-air missiles. We ask, why the UAE? Because the United Arab Emirates requested the assistance, and because the Gulf is a critical hub. Currently, there are roughly 20,000 Australians living in the UAE. The government's justification is rooted firmly in defence. Prime Minister Albanese and Defence Minister Richard Marles have been categorical. Australia is not sending ground troops to Iran. Australia is not taking offensive action. The Wedgetail is an airborne early warning and control aircraft. Its job is to secure the airspace, provide long-range reconnaissance, and act as a shield. The government states that this deployment operates strictly under Australian law and policy, and they have notified the UN Security Council under Article 51 of the Charter, the right to collective self-defense. And there's a concrete reason for their caution. On March 3, just days before the deployment was announced, the Al Minhad Air Base in the UAE, which houses Australian personnel, was attacked by Iranian loitering munitions. The reality for Canberra is that its citizens and its soldiers are already in the crosshairs of a regional war. The government argues they have a fundamental duty to protect their people. But in modern warfare, the definition of protection is highly subjective. And that is exactly where the political consensus in Canberra has completely shattered. Enter Australian Greens. They are the third largest political force in the country, and they are accusing the Labor government of profound deception. Senator Larissa Waters and Senator David Shoebridge have led the charge, stating that the deployment is not in Australia's national interest, but entirely in the national interest of the United States. Their accusation hinges on two crucial arguments. The first is the concept of military fungibility. The Greens argue that by sending Australian Wedgetail to guard the skies over the UAE, Australia is effectively taking over defense duties from the US and Israel. This in turn frees up American-Israeli military assets to conduct offensive strikes inside Iran. In the words of Senator Shoebridge, every military asset Labor sends to the Gulf frees up US and Israeli assets to continue the illegal attacks. The second argument is about data. The Wedgetail aircraft is essentially a flying supercomputer. The Greens have raised alarms, echoed by independent academic researchers, that surveillance data and intelligence collected by the Australian aircraft are being fed directly into the US warfighting machine. If your radar spots a target and you hand that coordinate to an ally who fires the missile, are you still a non-combatant? And this is not just a theoretical debate in the Australian Senate. It has a direct geopolitical consequence. On March 19, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Ismail Baghei appeared on Australian national television. He accused the US and Israel of terrorist acts and illegal warfare. And then he delivered a stark warning. He stated that because Australia provided military support to the UAE, Australia's military assets in the Gulf are now considered legitimate targets for Iran's self-defense. The shield has become a magnet. But the anger from the Greens is not just about what the government did. It's about how they did it. There was no vote in the House of Representatives. There was no binding resolution in the Senate. Under the Australian Constitution, the power to deploy the military is an executive prerogative. The Prime Minister and the Defence Minister hold the keys. For over 20 years, the Greens have tried to change this. And on March 25, 2026, they reintroduced the Defense Amendment, parliamentary approval of Overseas Service Bill. The legislation is simple. It demands that both houses of parliament must vote before the Australian Defence Force can be sent overseas into warlike actions. They point to other major democracies like Germany, France, Finland, Denmark, and Spain, where the legislature must approve the deployment of troops. And the Greens have the data on their side. A recent Resolve poll conducted in mid-March showed that a staggering 61% of Australians want to stay out of the conflict entirely. Only 13% are eager for involvement. Furthermore, historical polling indicates that up to 90% of the Australian public supports the idea of a parliamentary vote before sending troops to war. Yet the bill was firmly rejected by both the governing Labour Party and the opposition Liberal National Coalition. The major parties argue that the executive branch needs the agility to act immediately in a crisis. They argue that debating a deployment in Parliament while missiles are flying endangers national security. The opposition Liberal Party has actually demanded more support for the US alliance, and figures like One Nation's Pauline Hanson have openly called for Australia to actively enter the conflict alongside Donald Trump. But the Greens counter that agility is just a polite word for secrecy. They argue that a decision made in a dark room by two people is not agility. It is a democratic bypass. Australia is a middle power. Its entire strategic defense doctrine is anchored to its alliance with the United States. From the intelligence sharing of Pine Gap to the nuclear submarine promises of the Australia-UK-US Pact, Canberra's security umbrella is held by Washington. When Washington calls, Canberra answers. That is the unwritten rule of the alliance. But alliances come with a price tag. The Albanese government finds itself caught in an impossible geopolitical vice. On one side, they must honor their security commitments to the United States and protect their citizens trapped in the Gulf. On the other side, they face a domestic population that is deeply exhausted by the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan, and a political faction in the Greens demanding that the era of unquestioning compliance must end. The 85 personnel and the Wedgetail aircraft are now in the United Arab Emirates. The missiles have been delivered. The policy is in motion. But the debate over who actually holds the power to send the nation to war remains unsettled. Australia has drawn a line in the sand, claiming its mission is purely defensive. But as history has shown, once you step in a war zone, the line between defense and offense is often written by the enemy. Facts inform, but stories transform.